This video introduces you to some of the key problems and issues that typically arise in round 1 so that you're aware of those as you debrief the first round. To get started, please go into the reports area, and you've already been introduced to the how to debrief CAPSIM through the how to debrief CAPSIM video to some of the key reports here, including the Foundation's Fast Track, the annual reports, the analyst report, and the final score relative. To get a quick sense of what are the key issues that are going wrong, I usually go to the analyst report. And here you can see the example here is from Andrews again, but you will see common patterns across most teams in the early rounds. You'll see a few areas that I'd like to highlight. One issue or problem is in the customer satisfaction area, and obviously that's an important area because in order to perform well, you need to design, produce, market, and deliver products that customers want. A second area of problem is in forecasting, and typically you're having forecasting problems if you're not anticipating how much product you will actually sell and producing accordingly. So typically you have forecasting problems when you're running out of your product or if you have way too much inventory. So forecasting helps you make sure that you're producing the right number of products to deliver to the customer. And third, you can see there margin issues. In other words, there's not making enough money per product sold, their margins, in order to have a healthy, high profitable level. Even though this team is profitable, some of these issues, if they can fix them, their performance will improve. And as you'll see, these are common problems across most teams. So let's start with the first one of these issues, and I'm going to go in this order from customer satisfaction to forecasting to margins. So what to do about customer satisfaction and how to figure out how to improve it. A good place to start is by going back to the student guide, the member guide, and looking through what goes into customer satisfaction. What are the key areas? So let me take you to that. To go there, you go back to the Getting Started menu and click on Guide, and that third section of the guide, the Customer Survey Score, tells you what goes into customer satisfaction so that you can improve that. Some of these things you'll be familiar with now, but it goes through some of the key elements here of that process of what makes customers happy and wanting to buy your product, and often wanting to buy your product perhaps for a slightly higher price. So for example, the customer buying criteria, you should know those for each of those segments and what goes into that. The positioning score, in other words, how your product is positioned relative to what customers want within the two circles here for the low end and for the high end, right? And getting as close to those ideal spots as possible is going to improve customer satisfaction. Pricing, being aware of what customers want in terms of pricing is important. The MTBF score, the age score, and estimating some of the customer surveys. So one of the important things to start with for improving customer satisfaction is having a really good sense from the beginning of what goes into assessing customer satisfaction so that you can keep an eye out for that. And to get that, you find that under section 3 of the member guide. One other thing affects customers, that the satisfaction that's really important to understand. If you run out of your product and customers want it but can't buy it, that also decreases customer satisfaction scores, and that's also important. Let's take this to the next layer down and see how you actually see how you're doing in these areas. And to do that, you have to go back into reports and go back into Foundation Fast Track and open up Foundation Fast Track. So let's see how, just as an example, Andrew's product did in these areas. You can go into that by looking at the low-end segment and the high-end segment pages on Foundation Fast Tracks. And what you can see here is Able, which is Andrew's product, didn't sell too badly, And in fact, the December customer survey, which looks purely at issues such as the specs on the product and the issues of whether the product is well designed and marketing, is actually the same as some of the other teams. But one of the key things that did happen with Able is you can see they stocked out. So certainly the product could have been better designed, because when the better designed product, the higher this customer survey score would be, and perhaps better marketed. But the key issue really is around the stocking out here, because if you're stocking out of your product, it doesn't matter how well your product is designed and marketed, there's not enough of it to sell, right? So that gets us to that second problem that we saw in the analyst report. So go back to the analyst report here. So we see that part of the issue with customer satisfaction can be around the design of the product, the marketing of the product, and so forth. But part of it is also, if you stock out, then customers are not going to be happy. And that spills over, therefore, into the second major area or problem here, which is forecasting. Forecasting is crucial. You need to have a good sense, and it's as much art as science here, because you have to be able to look at what other teams are doing, but you have to have a good sense of how much you need to anticipate you'll be able to sell, because you'll need to produce that amount and maybe a little bit more in order to have a little buffer so that you don't run out. And the key here to forecasting and to producing the right amount is to produce enough that you satisfy customers and maybe have a little bit of inventory left over, without producing so much that you're left over with a ton of inventory that both eats through your cash and reduces your profitability because of the inventory carrying costs. So how do you forecast better along the way? The best way to forecast here is to look back again at the getting started area and to remind yourself what goes into the forecasting and what should help you forecast appropriately. And over here, section 9 here reminds you of some of the basic processes of forecasting. Here, your situation analysis that you completed will help you, because if you remember, in the situation analysis, you tried to figure out ahead of time how much demand would be in each round, and some of the basic forecasting methods here, for example, take you through that process of saying, well, how much did I produce in the last round and sell in the last round, and how much is each of these segments growing? So the example they take you through here is, if you sold 700,000 units in the low end segment and the segment is growing at 10%, then you will anticipate being able to sell another 70,000 units in that low end segment. And figuring out your total demand for your product involves looking at both sales in the low end and high end segments for that unit, so that you can think ahead to, well, how much did I sell last year? How fast is each of those segments growing in terms of demand? And so how much additional will I sell this next year? That's only helpful if you didn't actually run out, obviously, of your product from the previous round. And what with this section of the member guide tells you is how to forecast, not only if you didn't run out, but also if you did run out. And what it indicates further down here is that when you do run out, you have to look at not your actual market share, because obviously if you run out, that actual market share is just based on an old historical number of running out of product, but what would your potential market share have been if you hadn't run out before, and taking that into account in forecasting your sales for the coming year. So to do that, once again, you can go into Foundation Fast Track, which can help you with making those decisions. So let's go to Foundation Fast Track, and the key here is looking at market share. Right? Page 7 of Foundation Fast Track will take you to market share, and what it is, both your actual market share as well as what your potential would have been if you had actually had enough product on hand. So what you can see here is that Able had 19.7 market share in the low end, and and 16.9% in the high end, but their actual market share, their potential market share, if they hadn't run out, would have been higher than that, almost 21% in the low end and almost 18% in the high end. And so if you run out of your product, you want to use these potential market shares to calculate what your demand would be for the next round. And one way to do that would be to take these market share figures, these potential market share figures, 21% and 18%, and then go back up to the two different segments, and look at the overall demand in that segment, right? So for example, in the high-tech segment, the total demand is 2,160 units this last round, but we know that that segment is growing at 20%, so you have to increase the total number of sales in that segment by 20%, so 2,160 plus another 20%, and then multiply that through times your your potential market share for the high-end segment for Able, which in this case was 18%, and that will help you forecast better for how much more Able you should produce for this next round. You have to do the same thing in the low-end segment to get a sense of that. Okay, so if you are not sure of how to do that, once again, the member guide on the Getting Started area takes you through that step by step, so you can use that as a guide to more in a step-by-step way getting your forecasting improved. Now obviously this is based on the last round. This is your potential share based on the last round, and there's the art part of this, and instead of the science, is looking at what your competitors are doing and trying to guess and anticipate whether or not they are making improvements that may be changing things for the current round. But you don't have to worry about that until you get the basic math of forecasting down properly using potential and actual market shares to calculate what you think you can actually sell and hence produce. And just a reminder, once again, you want to produce and have on hand a little bit more than your than your anticipated forecast, just so that you have some buffer in case your product does better than you anticipate. Maybe an extra 10% on hand to make sure you can do that. Let's look at that third area of the analyst report that I mentioned, which is margins, right? The margins are basically, here we're looking at contribution margins, and to improve your margins, you can do one of two things, or both of two things. Either increase your price. Now you don't want to increase your price so much that it's higher than what customers are willing to bear, and hence they aren't willing to buy your product, but certainly, especially if price is not a big factor to them, you want to keep your price relatively high within the range of the customer buying criteria, or you want to figure out ways to reduce your costs. And like all other things, you want to make sure you're looking at Foundation Fast Track to get a sense of what those parameters are for what customers want. So for each of the two segments, let's look in this case at the low-end segment. You'll want to keep an eye in terms of price. You can see that price is really important for customers in the low-end segment, but there's a range there of what they're willing to accept. So you can sort of try to keep your price competitive with other teams. You want to keep it high enough that you're also making money, right? Within the high-end segment, price is much less important. It only drives 25% of their customer buying criteria decisions, and you've got quite a bit of range there in terms of what you can do in terms of price to make more money per product, to improve your margins along the way. And you can see here that Able does have some room, as do all the other teams, if they want to try to improve their margins by increasing that a little bit, because you can see that they priced their product at 34 and customers are willing to bear a price of up to 45 here in the high-end segment, and they're not that price sensitive. Now you still do have to be careful, because if your competitors have significantly better prices than you, they can use that as a competitive advantage, but it's not necessarily the only thing that will decide how you perform. So you can, especially if your margins are low, it's not a bad idea to increase your prices a little bit, as long as it doesn't put you at a significant competitive disadvantage. The other thing to look at are your costs, obviously, and there you can look under your production page over here in the Foundation Fast Track, the production analysis, to see how your production costs, such as your materials costs, your labor contributions, your overtime, and so forth, compare to some of the other teams, to find out where you stand compared to the other teams, and to figure out ways to improve that. You can obviously do several things. Control your overtime shifts by increasing your capacity to make sure that you're not running too much overtime. There are automation options and other options to control costs, but there are trade-offs with each of those, as I hope you understand by now. So you have to kind of think through some of those trade-offs along the way. One other thing for looking at contribution margins and what goes into that is useful. If you go back to the situation analysis that you completed, you will remember that there is actually a section that you did on margin analysis as part of that, and you can always refer back to that to see, well, what affects margin, your margins, and what to do to improve that, so you have a better sense of that. So those are three areas I would encourage all teams to look out for in the first round and try to improve for the second round. First, your customer survey and your customer satisfaction. Second, your forecasting and production, so that you're neither running out of product nor having too much inventory. And the third being your margins, to make sure they're pushing, in terms of contribution margins, 30% or higher, so that you can be making a profit even as you compete.